We have just been hearing about his new book titled What's So Great About America? And at this point I would like Dinesh to give us a little overview of what he has covered in this latest bestseller.
Well, the book is a look at various critiques of America, the Islamic critique, the left-wing critique of American foreign policy, the people who say American culture is decadent and immoral, the people who say American history is defined by slavery and racism. So if all these criticisms are true, it's hard to see why America is worth defending. So in this book, I patiently try to look at these criticisms, but also to answer them.
One of the things that we noticed in your discussion was that the Islamic community, or that part of your book, mentions the fact that they've taken the moral high ground. What's your defense of America against the fact that they feel we're a decadent society?
I think behind the intellectual, behind the physical attack on America, there was an intellectual attack. And some of the Egyptian and Islamic thinkers, they say American society is based on freedom, but Islamic society is based on virtue. And they say virtue is a higher principle than freedom because freedom is often used badly. Now, I think that there is an element of truth in the Islamic critique that says that there is a lot in American culture that is sometimes trivial or excessive. But what the Islamic critics often miss is that while virtue is an important goal in society, freedom is needed to achieve virtue. In other words, without freedom there is no virtue. If a woman in Afghanistan or Iran is required to wear a veil, in a sense you can say she is not modest because she's being compelled. It's only when you can choose freely that you can choose the good.
Well, how would you defend against the Muslims who would say that, well, Britney Spears is the antithesis of everything that the Muslim community holds dear, and they feel that that's a vital threat to their national or international sovereignty?
Well, part of the problem is that the reason the Muslim elites are terrified is not because Americans, but rather young Muslims want to listen to Britney Spears. I mean, if the young Muslims didn't want to listen to Britney Spears, she would pose absolutely no threat to their society at all. But it's precisely because there is something appealing and attractive and enticing about American culture that the people who are the leaders in that culture want to keep the American influence out. I think part of looking at America purely in terms of its popular culture is not always accurate or fair. I mean, my mom sitting in her living room in Bombay, India, will look at the Jerry Springer show and all the various freaks and so on the show and say, well, is that how Americans really are? Well, I think in America we know that that's not how most Americans live. That's sort of the modern equivalent of the circus. But nevertheless, for people living abroad, it's sometimes difficult to distinguish between some of the elements of popular entertainment and the way Americans really live.
Why is the Muslim world now attacking us?
There are a couple of reasons. I think the main one is that Islam used to be perhaps the world's greatest civilization. And in one of the great seesaw movements of history, Islam has gone down and Western civilization and America have come up. And so the people in the Islamic world are looking at America, I think, with a certain degree of frustration and bitterness and perhaps even envy. And so part of what's going on is a lashing out against a more successful civilization that is commanding the fascination and the appeal of much of the world.
One of the things that's been mentioned sometimes is the fact that there are lots of have-not nations in the Islamic world, and they feel that America should give back something to them. I guess my question to you is, what's the resolution? Where do we go for a resolution between Islam and the Western civilizations?
The dispute between Islam and the West, I think, is not fundamentally an economic conflict. Bin Laden himself is one of the richest men in the world. He belongs probably on the Forbes 400 rich list. And most of the terrorists who came from middle to upper middle class families. So this is not a case of the wretched of the earth lashing out against people who have more. I think the roots of this conflict are religious and political and ideological. They're not fundamentally economic.
You verge on an area that's interesting in that we're looking at racial profiling in this country as a big thing prior to 9/11, and now afterwards the issues are against the Muslim community or against Arabs in general. What's your belief on that?
There was an interesting survey among African Americans in America asking them what they thought about racial profiling. 71% said they were in favor of racial profiling for Arabs. And what this shows is that racial profiling is not a mere extension of racism. Rather, it is an application of common sense. In the area of homeland security, racial profiling is based on the recognition that the average Swede is much less likely to pose a threat to America than the average Muslim. If your name is Sven, you are less of a danger on average than if your name is Muhammad. Now that's common sense, it's not bigotry. And yet, once again, the country goes to great lengths to try to say, listen, if your name is Muhammad and you're a law-abiding citizen, we're going to try to do everything to protect your rights. Now, if my name was Muhammad and I was always asked to take off my shoes and always be searched and so on, and I was a law-abiding guy, I would in fact be irritated, I would in fact be angry. But I wouldn't be angry at the airport security guys or at the cops or at the FBI. I would be angry at the 19 terrorists who are giving Muslims a bad name.
One of the things with John Ashcroft now, of course, is the fact that there's a lot of look, even from the conservative community, about our civil rights and about the fact that there's going to be a lot more invasive government intervention into our lives. Have you looked at that issue and decided whether that's positive or negative for the society?
I think that our principles of freedom are paramount. And yet it is true that in a time of a war, certain of those freedoms are temporarily sacrificed. I think our history shows that these sacrifices are temporary. There was liberty suspended during the Civil War, during World War II. Those liberties were immediately restored when the war was over. I don't see any mass-scale surveillance of American citizens. I do think that we've got to do a better job on the borders. I don't find any threat to our liberty in asking people to produce their fingerprints and checking them against criminal records and so on. I think those things are essential. Ultimately, I do think it's very difficult for a free society to truly protect its homeland because of the enemy to attack is just too great. Many of us are focusing now on should we arm the pilots and should we have better screening techniques at the airports. But see, that all assumes that the terrorists having attacked at the airports are do the same thing all over again. Chances are they won't. And it's very difficult to anticipate every threat at every point and erect a fortress against it. So I think our best hope in the war is offensive, to go after the Al-Qaeda network and after the terrorists and defeat them where they are, rather than trying to stop them at the water's edge.
One of those things that you mentioned in your 70-year today was the fact that the 70-year conflict with the Soviet Union may pale in comparison to the longer war against this Muslim and Christendom battle that's going on. So what you're saying is that we should look for less